Science and the Christian faith have a long history that's filled with nothing but conflict. At least that's what some people want us to believe. But today we're going to talk to a historian who's just written a book that sees the relationship between science and the Christian faith in a different way. So we're going to talk about it today on the Science and Faith podcast. He is a historian in residence and intellectual historian at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has a PhD in religious studies from the University of Queensland and a Master of Arts in History of Christianity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He's a teacher and a researcher and the author of a new book, Science, Religion, and the Protestant Tradition, Retracing the Origins of Conflict, published by University of Pittsburgh Press. His book traces the origins, development, and popularization of the conflict thesis. That's the idea that science and religion are irrevocably at odds. It's my pleasure to welcome to the podcast today Dr. James Ungureanu. Thanks so much, James, for joining us today.
Thank you, Mario. It's great to be here.
So I love your book. It's an absolutely fascinating read from a historical and a theological perspective. So I want to just start by kind of jumping into this idea of the relationship of science and religion, or what I think we can assume for our conversation, religion here is going to be the Christian religion.
Yeah.
Can you just walk us through that relationship? Kind of give us an overview of the history of science and religion. How did that relationship start, and how has it progressed?
Yeah, sure. I think if you ask most people for an opinion on science and religion, they will likely tell you that they are in conflict or at war. And again, when I say religion, I mean specifically Christianity, and we can talk about the distinctions a bit more later if you like. But the most tenacious view of the historical relationship between science and religion is that they are fundamentally at odds. You have notions like Christianity was responsible for the demise of ancient Greek science, that the medieval Christians suppressed the growth of science. They thought the world was flat, and there was intellectual darkness of the Middle Ages. You have the idea that Galileo was imprisoned and tortured for advancing Copernicanism, and that the so-called scientific revolution liberated science from religion. And then more recently, you have the idea that Christian theologians opposed Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and so on. I mean, the list is almost endless. But the historical reality is not so simple. I think early in the 20th century, for example, you have English mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. He warned readers, he warned us of the difficulty of talking about the relationship between science and religion. He wrote that although conflict between science and religion is what naturally occurs in our minds when we think about the subject, the true facts of the case are much more complex, and they refuse to be summarized in simple terms. The terms in question, of course, are science and religion, and according to Whitehead, they have always been in a state of continual development or flux. So at its most elementary level, positions of either conflict or concord between science and religion are, in a way, undermined by an abundance of historical evidence that prevents us from making complete explanations or descriptions of how they interacted. The historical record, in short, reveals that the relationship between science and religion, or science and Christianity, has always been incredibly complicated. And an awareness of this complicated history, this complicated story, is central, I think, to explaining how we have arrived where we are today and where we might be going. I suppose a more conservative, if you will, approach was taken by St. Augustine, probably the most well-known early church father. And he addressed very directly the relationship between Christianity and natural philosophy or pagan philosophy. In his writings, St. Augustine proposed that the classical tradition should serve as handmaid of Christian theology.
That's where that infamous that infamous line that theology is the queen of the sciences, or that the science is the handmaid of theology. Is that where that comes from? Is that from Augustine?
Right. Yeah, it's exactly right. He said that if those who are called philosophers have said things that are indeed true, and are well accommodated to our faith, they should not be feared. Rather, what they have said should be taken from them as from unjust possessors and converted to our use. So again, this idea of baptizing pagan philosophy into the Christian tradition.
And that was later picked up by John Calvin, was it not? Where Calvin basically said, hey, if there are pagan people who are discovering truth that is truth, we can't discount that truth just because it came from someone who's not a Christian. All truth is God's truth, I think is the phrase that they used to. So is Calvin building on Augustine there?
Yeah, he is. Luther took Martin Luther, another Protestant reformer, like the Protestant reformer, right? He took a more Tertullian view of pagan philosophy, but Calvin is a little bit more ambivalent towards it. But he does say about Aristotle in particular that although he was a heathen and condemned, that nevertheless he was a genius. So John Calvin took the more I wouldn't say compromise, but more accommodating understanding of other traditions than the Christian traditions.
Mm-hmm. So what I kind of hear you saying is the relationship between science and faith, or science and religion, particularly the Christian religion, is way more complicated and nuanced. Maybe not complicated. Maybe that's not the right word. It's way more in depth and nuanced than the somewhat simplistic ideas that are floating around out there that the church has dominated science and held back its progress for thousands of years, and only recently have scientists been bold enough to come out as atheists, because they've been atheists all along, but they just haven't been able to publicly declare their atheism. Within the last 200 years have come out, been able to take this bold stance as atheists and naturalists and move science and progress it forward. That's somewhat of a comical characterization of that relationship. I mean, listening to you, it sounds like science and religion has had not a centuries, a millennium ages, multiple millennia, thousands of years of a relationship stemming back to the ancient Greeks with this natural philosophy and things like that. And then kind of post-Christ in the first century, the Christian church kind of helping its members understand natural philosophy and understanding it from a Christian perspective, but at the same time discipling science and redeeming science in a sense, and moving it and progressing it in very healthy ways. So much so that we have the invention of the university, for example. The idea of the invention of hospitals came out of that. So this is something that is historically way more in-depth and nuanced than this idea of science and faith have always been in conflict.
Yeah, I mean, you can be very selective and find certain thinkers in the Christian tradition that were very antagonistic towards pagan philosophy or natural philosophy in general. But even doing that, you're kind of ripping them out of this wider context of accommodation and acceptance, and again, this whole baptizing of these traditions into the Christian tradition. And that sort of thing happened much later, and it was part of tensions that were actually building up, not between science and religion, but between certain theological understandings of the sciences or certain theological traditions. And that kind of brings us to the figures in my own book. And we're talking about the conflict thesis. And I think when most historians or most people hear about the conflict thesis, they're thinking about the late 19th century, particularly with the rise of geology and evolutionary theory. And there was a segment of thinkers who seem to argue that there is a conflict, but again, how they understood conflict is much more nuanced and much more particular than kind of a more generalized understanding. So
right. Well, let's get into that. So we talked about the kind of the long history. It's millennial. I don't know. I can't seem to find the right word there. It's thousands of years old.
yeah,
That relationship. It was born a long time ago, and it has evolved to the point where wherever it is today.
right,
So then let's talk about that. Let's talk about this idea, this general idea that's floating around out there that, by the way, is not something that's just accepted by atheists, but at least according to the most recent Pew Research poll that I believe was a 2020 Pew Research poll, 60% of Americans believe that science and faith, or science and religion, conflict.
right.
Where does this come from, and why do people believe this?
Right. I mean, in a nutshell, historians have scientifically traced the origins of the conflict thesis to the late 19th century, specifically to Anglo-American writers. For instance, you have scholars point to the scientific naturalists, a Victorian clique made up of people like biologist Thomas H. Huxley, physicist John Tyndall, and evolutionary philosopher Herbert Spencer, among others. And these guys supposedly employed the thesis in their attempt to professionalize and secularize the sciences. More precisely still, most scholars see New York University chemist John William Draper and historian and first president of Cornell University Andrew Dickson White as the co-founders of a philosophy of history that endorsed the belief that science and religion have been and always will be at odds. So Draper and White are big figures, consequential figures in the historical studies of science and religion. In his History of Conflict, Draper claimed that the history of science was, quote, a narrative of the conflict of two contending powers, the expansive force of the human intellect on the one side and the compression arising from traditionary faith and human interest on the other. He explained that faith is in its nature unchangeable, stationary, whereas science is in its nature progressive, and eventually a divergence or conflict between takes place. Andrew Dickson White was never a scientist. Again, he was sort of a man of literature. He was born in New York around the time that Draper and his family were making their way to America from England. He was known for his Battlefields of Science lecture in 1869, in which he traced the great sacred struggle for the liberty of science. So he's reviewing these alleged battles fought in cosmology, astronomy, chemistry, anatomy, and geology. And he took this lecture and expanded it into a sort of a small book in 1876 entitled The Warfare of Science. And after resigning from Cornell, he spent decades expanding this narrative even further, which eventually turned into his 2-volume masterpiece, The History of the Warfare of Science with Theology and Christendom. So according to historians of science, Draper and White set the terms of the debate. Few people cite them today. Most who claim there is some kind of conflict between science and religion usually follow one of or more of the narratives set out in their books, though. So even though no one really knows about them anymore, their ideas are still around.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting is something you mentioned about Draper. You said that Draper argued that faith is somewhat fixed and stationary, and science is changing and advancing and constantly in flux.
Right.
That's really interesting because when you read authors like the new atheist authors, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, the scientists that are new atheists, not the philosophers so much, or you read anyone who kind of argues for this conflict model, that seems to be the opposite of what's being argued today from that perspective. Is it's science that is true and unchanging, and it gives us the bare truth, and it's religion that's kind of seen as this wishy-washy kind of fluid. It changes, it can't make up its mind. It's almost as if the narrative has somehow been flipped from what Draper was arguing, and yet somehow, even though those two now are kind of complete opposite narratives, they're still trying to argue for the same conclusion.
Yeah, yeah, and even our understanding of Draper and White are a little bit more. It needs some correction, I think, and this is what essentially what my book attempts to do is actually correct and clarify what their positions actually were. For example, many historians of science think Draper in particular had something against the Roman Catholic Church. And no doubt he did. But really, so did everyone else at that time in the late 19th century.
So he was just fitting in with everyone else.
No, I mean, anti-Catholic sentiment it was sort of at its height in the late 19th century, and especially in America. In terms of White, historians argue that his religious criticism, the religious criticism that he received for his beloved Cornell University, sort of set him off. But again, White had already formulated his views prior to founding Cornell University. In fact, he was teaching his narrative to undergraduate students at the University of Michigan. So the conventional view or interpretation, I think, fails because, simply put, it kind of ignores what Draper and White actually said they were doing. Draper's History of the Conflict was largely a condensed version of previously published work. Most importantly, Draper had published his History of the Intellectual Development of Europe in 1863, nearly a decade before he published his History of Conflict. And in this book, he made a crucial distinction that most historians of science have forgotten or kind of ignored. And he discussed the so-called paganization of Christianity under Roman Emperor Constantine. And Draper distinguished between Christianity and ecclesiastical organizations. The former, he wrote, Christianity is a gift of God. The latter are a product of human exigencies and human invention, and therefore open to criticism or condemnation. And he's talking about ecclesiastical organizations, the authorities. He argued that paganization of Christianity had resulted in, quote, the tyranny of theology over thought. He declared that those who had known what religion was in the apostolic days might look with boundless surprise on what was now engrafted upon it, with passing under its name. So he took a more positive, I guess, view of what religion is. But again, we have to figure out what his interpretation, what his definition of religion. Even in his History of Conflict, under closer inspection, continues to make distinctions, or these types of distinctions. He argued that he would only consider the orthodox or extremist views, and not the moderate ones.
So that do you think that that's what we're seeing today? Do you think that kind of that is still true of what's in people's minds in terms of the populace when they think about science and religion?
That's a good question. I think it really depends on the person. I think there are people who take a very unsophisticated, I guess, interpretation of the biblical text, for example, or a very unsophisticated understanding of what science does or what science is. And these kind of simplistic understanding leads to a lot of confusion and misunderstandings, and that's where sometimes conflict arises. So I mean, you have the new atheists who are very black and white, and they have these abstract categories of science and religion. They come into conflict, and it really depends on how they define what science and what religion is. And I think what it ultimately boils down to is not so much science and religion, but you have contending theological interpretations or contending epistemologies or contending worldviews that come into conflict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like their work, by and large, has been somewhat misunderstood by later readers, and I think it's a real shame that you hear these guys have kind of spent an enormous amount of time and effort putting out what they believe is an attempt to reconcile science and the Christian religion. And here we are, centuries later, kind of somewhat misunderstanding and misconstruing what they're saying. That's a real tragedy for them, and it's somewhat unjust of us to read them in that way and not fully appreciate what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I think they're also partly to blame. I mean, the language they used, it could be appropriated by others very easily, and their kind of loose definition of religion, it kind of lend itself to mischaracterization. And one reason why I think Draper and White have often been misunderstood is that their ideas were in fact appropriated by secularists, free thinkers, and atheists at the end of the 19th century. And beginning of the 20th century. Perhaps the most important secularists who have appropriated Draper's historical narrative, for example, was a guy named Joseph Mccabe. Joseph Mccabe was a Roman Catholic monk who had abandoned his religious beliefs around 1890, 1895. He became a prolific author. He wrote over 200 books on science, history, and religion. He was an advocate of atheism. He frequently forecast the doom of Christianity in light of modern science. And in the 1920s, he published a little book entitled The Conflict Between Science and Religion. And basically, he repeated Draper's narrative, but unlike Draper, Mccabe gleefully cheered on the decay of religion all over the earth. He welcomed it. Historians of the 21st century, he argued, will look back with amusement at the men of science and theologians in the previous centuries, how they attempted to find a reconciliation between science and religion.
Now, as a historian then, and I'll wrap it up with this. As a historian, you're interested in what has happened in the past and sort of looking at the story as it unfolded and brought us to where we are now. As a pastor, as a theologian, I'm interested in the present. I'm not disinterested in the past, but I want to focus on the present and looking at how we can make changes as one of those things in the present. So now that we kind of have this a somewhat of a better understanding of how we have reached this point as a society from a historical perspective, where we've come from and now where we are with this conflict narrative. As a historian, can you offer me any advice about how we move forward as a culture in changing this perception that science and religion are inherently in conflict? Because as I think about it, I think the noble task of trying to set out to reconcile science and religion, even though they're not inherently in conflict, in fact, they don't need to be reconciled because they're not conflicting with one another. Really what we're doing is we're addressing the idea that they're in conflict and trying to solve that problem. How do we do that without making the same mistake as Draper and White did, where they set out to do something and they achieved the exact opposite? Let's avoid that mistake and let's move forward and say, okay, we're gonna help society and culture grasp this harmonious idea about science and religion, but we're going to do it in a way that's going to have the opposite effect of what Draper and White did, which was cause a lot more confusion and promote this conflict thesis. Do you have any advice for us on how to do that, not to kind of avoid the historical mistakes that have been made in the past?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky thing, and I think this past month I got a hold of again Richard Niebuhr's Christ against where's the title? Christ and Culture. And again, he calls it this enduring problem that's always been for Christians from the very beginning. You have different categories. You have Christ against culture, Christ of culture, Christ above culture, Christ and culture and paradox. You have the dualists who kind of separate them. You have the synthesis who kind of bring them together. And you have the Christ, the transformer of culture. So I think this is a kind of an internal discussion within, I guess, your theological tradition. This historical narrative shows you that science and religion are these categories that have developed over time, and so we shouldn't speak in absolute terms here. The historical narrative shows us the complexity and how complicated this relationship has been, but we're still left with trying to figure out theologically, how do we position ourselves, those in the Christian tradition or those in the Jewish tradition or those in the Muslim tradition, how do they position themselves with the wider cultural tradition? And I think it's still a progress and development. You know, we're still talking about it, and the fact that we're talking about it here on this platform is helpful. It will help people think about it some more. A brief survey of when science and Christianity meet reveals that there's no easy patterns of conflict or concord. So it's not necessarily harmonious, right? There are instances where conflict really does occur at an epistemological level, at a worldview level, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the one pattern that does consistently emerge, though, from at least a historical narrative that I've discussed, is that holding such negative attitudes toward traditional Christian theology, like Draper and White did, Protestants of the early modern period actually eliminated the very possibility of having a genuine Christian dialogue with science. That is, some have perhaps been too eager to embrace the latest scientific facts and have thus attempted too quickly to harmonize Christianity with these facts. But in doing so, many lost their faith in the process. This loss of faith should not be interpreted simply as mere atheism, which is almost never the case, but sort of the abandonment of core Christian beliefs. And I think the danger remains present for Christians today. There's a recent Pew Research study, I think it's different from the one that you mentioned, but they found that many Americans continue to believe in a higher power. A very small majority believe in the God of the Bible. A very small majority believe in the God of the Bible. So they believe in a higher power, this new God, an unknown God, which is kind of divorced from Scripture and Christian tradition. And here we can remind ourselves, I think, of what the Apostle Paul told the church in Corinth many years ago, is that we ought to demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against knowledge of God, and to take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. You know, Paul was calling on the Corinthian Christians to engage the worldviews of the pagan Corinthians, taking their philosophies as captive. And again, this is a very old idea, like I mentioned in the very beginning of this talk, that, you know, this is an Augustinian idea. All truth is God truth, and other traditions that say something that's truthful ought to be taken in and sort of baptized in a way. And this is sort of the Augustinian approach to the non-Christian world. Recall that St. Augustine also sought to defend the integrity of Genesis against philosophers who criticized it as legend or irrational. He argued in response that human language, though, is very tricky, and to understand the meaning of words, we must be careful to discern their intentions. When it comes to the biblical text, we must be attentive not only to its divine source, but also the human element. So this is kind of a very humble approach that Augustine takes. The solution to conflict for St. Augustine is the humility, both to the interpretation of nature and the interpretation of Scripture. And I think that sort of humble approach is being aware of the tensions. It's a good beginning to a more constructive dialogue.
Well, his book is called Science, Religion, and the Protestant Tradition, Retracing the Origins of Conflict. It's published by the University of Pittsburgh Press. It's available through them, or obviously you can get it on Amazon.com. Be sure to pick up a copy of the history of the relationship between science and religion. It's a fascinating one, and it's one that we as Christians really should be informed about, understanding the true nature of the history of the relationship, but also kind of where certain ideas come from and how they take root and how they affect us as a culture and as a society, and also as individuals, and the Christians in in the church. So, James, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today. It's been such a great pleasure talking with you and getting some historical insight about the nature of the relationship between science and religion.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
All right, well, listen, if you guys have a question or a comment or an idea for a topic for a future podcast, be sure to reach out to us. You can send us an email. Our email address is scienceandfaithdortmund@gmail.com. And then be sure to check out our website, scienceandfaith.de. We got some great resources there, also some book recommendations and some other great articles and stuff that we post there as well. So be sure and check that out. And thanks so much for tuning in this week, and we look forward to seeing you on our next episode.